My name is Thomas Miller, and for the past 23 years, I have taught international relations at Dartmouth College, specializing in the geopolitical theories of John Mearsheimer, whose work on offensive realism and great power competition has shaped how we understand the structural forces driving nations toward conflict, even when they seek only security. I earned my doctorate from the University of Chicago in 2002, the same institution where Mearsheimer himself has taught for decades, and I have spent my career applying his theoretical framework to real-world crises, watching as the predictions he made in books like The Tragedy of Great Power Politics unfold with unsettling precision across every region of the globe. What brings me to this lecture today is an event that occurred in September 2025, one that most Americans have not fully grasped in its significance, an incident in the Caribbean involving a United States Navy destroyer, the USS Jason Dunham, and Venezuelan military forces that marked a turning point not just in hemispheric relations, but in the entire architecture of American global power. This is not another distant conflict in some faraway region that we can afford to ignore. This is a challenge to American dominance in our own backyard, in waters that have been effectively controlled by Washington for nearly 2 centuries. And understanding what happened requires us to look beyond the immediate facts and examine the structural forces that Mearsheimer has spent his life analyzing. I ask you to stay with me through this entire lecture, to watch until the very end, because the incident I am about to describe cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a larger pattern that reveals fundamental shifts in global power distribution, and only by examining the full context can we appreciate what is truly at stake for the United States and for the international order that has shaped our lives since the end of World War II. Please comment below and tell me where you are watching from, what city and what country, because this crisis affects not just Americans, but everyone living in a world where the assumptions that governed international politics for decades are rapidly dissolving. On the morning of September 4th, 2025, Venezuelan F-16 fighter aircraft conducted multiple low-altitude overflights of the USS Jason Dunham, a guided missile destroyer operating in the Caribbean Sea, as part of what the Pentagon described as counter-narcotics operations targeting vessels allegedly associated with the trendy Aragua Gang, a criminal organization that U.S. officials have labeled a transnational threat. The Pentagon issued a statement calling Venezuela's actions highly provocative and warning against interference with American military operations. But what followed was not the immediate escalation one might expect when a regional power challenges the world's dominant military. Instead, Washington maintained what can only be described as strategic silence, a calculated restraint that speaks volumes about the constraints facing American power in 2025, constraints that Mearsheimer's theory helps us understand as structural rather than merely political. The incident did not occur in a vacuum. It followed weeks of mounting tension between Caracas and Washington after President Trump authorized military strikes against boats suspected of drug trafficking in Caribbean waters, operations that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro condemned as fabricating a new war and as direct violations of Venezuelan sovereignty. The United States had deployed substantial naval assets to the region, including the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world with a price tag of $13 billion, along with at least 5 destroyers, a cruiser, littoral combat ships, submarines, and 3 amphibious warships, creating a flotilla that represented billions in deployed military hardware and the commitment of more than 4,500 sailors and Marines to operations ostensibly focused on counter-narcotics, but widely interpreted in Caracas and across Latin America as preparation for regime change. The Gerald R. Ford alone, powered by 2 A-1B nuclear reactors and capable of generating 25% more electrical power than previous carrier classes, embodies American technological superiority and the capacity to project overwhelming force anywhere on the planet. Yet even this symbol of unmatched military capability has not translated into the political outcomes Washington seeks. Venezuela responded to the American buildup not with capitulation, but with defiance, activating what Maduro called the Independence Plan 200, an integrated defense strategy combining regular military forces, militias, and police in preparation for potential conflict. What makes this confrontation particularly significant from a Mearsheimer perspective is that Venezuela is not a peer competitor, it is not Russia or China, it does not possess the economic or military capacity to challenge American power directly, yet it has created a situation where the United States faces meaningful costs and risks in attempting to enforce its will. Venezuela has spent approximately $20 billion over the past 2 decades purchasing Russian military equipment, a massive investment for a country whose economy has been devastated by sanctions and mismanagement, but one that has provided Caracas with capabilities that complicate American military planning. Since 2005, Venezuela acquired 24 Sukhoi Su-30 Mk2 fighter jets through contracts worth more than $1 billion, along with 53 military helicopters including Mi-35 attack helicopters and Mi-17 multi-role aircraft, 92 T-72 Me-1 tanks, S-300VM surface-to-air missile systems, and 100,000 Kalashnikov AK-103 rifles, plus a factory to produce more. Russia became Venezuela's primary arms supplier precisely because Washington had cut off military sales, and Moscow saw an opportunity not just to earn billions in revenue, but to establish a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere, directly challenging American regional hegemony in a way that Mearsheimer's theory predicts great powers will do when they identify vulnerabilities in a rival's sphere of influence. The pattern continued into 2025 when documents obtained by the Washington Post revealed that Maduro sent a letter to Russian President Vladimir Putin in mid-October, requesting urgent military assistance as American forces concentrated in the Caribbean, specifically asking for 14 missile units to strengthen air defense systems, restoration of Sukhoi Su-30 Mk2 fighters that Venezuela had previously purchased, overhaul of 8 engines and 5 radars, and logistical support through a medium-term financing plan of 3 years via the Russian state defense conglomerate Rostec. Maduro described the Sukhoi jets as the most important deterrent the Venezuelan national government had when facing the threat of war, a striking admission that reveals how even outdated Russian equipment from the 2000s provides enough capability to force American military planners to take Venezuelan defenses seriously. Venezuela also deployed Russian-supplied Buk-M2E surface-to-air missile systems capable of engaging F-35 stealth fighters, F-15E Strike Eagles, F-A-18 Super Hornets, and Tomahawk cruise missiles, systems equipped with 9 S-36 fire control radar that can track targets at 70 kilometers and engage 4 simultaneously while resisting electronic jamming, and Kupol radar providing 360-degree surveillance detecting targets up to 150 kilometers away. These are not the most advanced systems in the world. Russia keeps its best technology for itself and its closest allies, but they are sufficient to create what military planners call an anti-access area denial environment, meaning American aircraft and ships cannot operate with impunity, they face real risks, and any military operation would involve casualties that would need to be justified to the American public. Maduro also reached out to China and Iran requesting expanded military cooperation from Beijing, including radar detection systems and framing American military action as an attack not just on Venezuela, but on China itself, while Iran shipped military gear including drones with 1,000-kilometer range, GPS scramblers, and passive detection equipment that allows Venezuelan forces to track American assets without emitting radar signals that could be targeted. The total value of these relationships runs into the billions when you account for arms sales, loans, oil for weapons barter arrangements, and technical support. And what Venezuela has effectively done is leverage great power competition to create a deterrent umbrella that makes American military action costly enough to give Washington pause. This is precisely the dynamic that Mearsheimer describes in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics when he explains how regional hegemons seek to prevent great powers in other regions from duplicating their feat, how the United States achieved hegemony in the Western Hemisphere by the late 1800s through westward expansion and enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, and how America then spent the 20th century intervening wherever it looked as though another state might achieve regional hegemony in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. Now we are witnessing the reverse dynamic, where Russia and China, unable to directly challenge American military superiority, instead support smaller powers like Venezuela to impose costs and distractions that dilute American focus and resources. The Pentagon's strategic silence in response to Venezuelan provocation reflects a calculation that Mearsheimer would recognize as rooted in the anarchic structure of international politics, where even the most powerful state cannot be everywhere at once and must prioritize threats based on their significance to core interests. The United States currently faces major security challenges in Eastern Europe, where Russia's war in Ukraine continues to threaten the balance of power. In the Indo-Pacific, where China's rise represents the first peer competitor America has confronted since the Soviet Union, and in the Middle East, where Iran and its proxies contest American influence. Each of these theaters requires substantial military resources, diplomatic attention, and political capital. And the brutal reality is that Venezuela, despite being located in America's own hemisphere, ranks lower in strategic priority than preventing Russian hegemony in Europe or Chinese hegemony in Asia. Mearsheimer argues that regional hegemons like the United States adopt what he calls offshore balancing in distant regions, preferring to let local powers check each other and intervening only when a potential hegemon emerges that could dominate an entire strategic region. The problem is that this strategy assumes a secure rear area. It assumes that the Western Hemisphere remains firmly under American control, so that Washington can project power globally without worrying about threats close to home. What the September 2025 incident reveals is that this assumption may no longer hold, that Venezuela with Russian and Chinese backing has created enough military capability to challenge American operations in the Caribbean, and that the costs of responding with overwhelming force might outweigh the benefits, especially when the justification rests on counter-narcotics operations rather than clear threats to American territory or vital interests. The legal and political complications are significant. American military strikes in September targeted boats in international waters that the Pentagon claimed were operated by drug traffickers, resulting in at least 11 deaths according to Venezuelan officials, but the evidence presented publicly has been limited, and the operations raise questions about the authority to use lethal military force against suspected criminals rather than military targets. When Venezuelan Foreign Ministry condemned the USS Jason Dunham for what it called hostile occupation of a fishing vessel, claiming that 18 armed American personnel boarded and occupied a small, harmless boat carrying 9 modest fishermen for 8 hours, the narrative became muddied, with Caracas framing the incident as unprovoked aggression and Washington insisting it was legitimate counter-narcotics enforcement. The White House defended the actions, with spokeswoman Anna Kelly referring to the deceased as narco-terrorists and calling Maduro an illegitimate president and fugitive, but this kind of rhetorical escalation without corresponding military escalation reveals the gap between American ambitions and American capabilities in the current strategic environment. The billions of dollars that the United States has invested in military superiority, the $13 billion carrier, the advanced destroyers equipped with Aegis combat systems and Tomahawk cruise missiles worth more than $1 million each, the F-35 stealth fighters that cost approximately $80 million per aircraft, all of this technological dominance has not prevented an economically weakened regional power from imposing costs and creating dilemmas that constrain American freedom of action. This is the tragedy that Mearsheimer identifies at the heart of great power politics, that even states seeking only security are driven by the anarchic structure of the international system to compete for power, and that this competition creates insecurity even for the dominant power. The United States did not seek confrontation with Venezuela. American policymakers would prefer that Caracas simply acquiesce to Washington's preferences in the hemisphere. But Venezuela, under Maduro, has chosen defiance, has invested billions in Russian weapons precisely to create deterrent capability, and has leveraged relationships with Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran to ensure that American military action would carry costs in terms of casualties, regional backlash, and potential escalation with great powers who have their own interests in demonstrating that American hegemony is no longer uncontested. Mearsheimer teaches us that geography plays a crucial role in shaping great power strategies, that the United States benefited enormously from having weak neighbors to the north and south and fish to the east and west, that this geographic isolation allowed America to develop economically and militarily without facing the constant threats that European powers faced from nearby rivals. The Monroe Doctrine, announced in 1823, declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonization and intervention. And over the following decades, the United States enforced this doctrine through a combination of diplomacy and military power, eventually achieving regional hegemony by the late 19th century. The Roosevelt Corollary of 1904 went further, asserting American intervention rights throughout Latin America to maintain order and prevent European powers from using financial disputes as pretexts for military involvement. This sphere of influence, this zone of unquestioned American dominance, provided the foundation for global power projection in the 20th century, because with a secure hemisphere, the United States could focus its military and economic resources on shaping the balance of power in Europe and Asia. Now, for the first time in generations, that security is being tested, not by a great power invasion, which remains impossible given American military superiority, but by a smaller power using asymmetric capabilities provided by great power rivals to impose costs and demonstrate that American dominance is no longer absolute. The incident with the USS Jason Dunham is not the crisis itself. It is a symptom of deeper structural changes in the international system, changes that Mearsheimer predicted would occur as American unipolarity following the Cold War gave way to renewed great power competition. Russia and China are not content to accept American global dominance. They are actively working to create a multipolar order where their interests are respected and their spheres of influence acknowledged, and supporting Venezuela is a relatively low-cost way to challenge American hegemony in Washington's own backyard. The billions that Moscow has earned from arms sales to Caracas, the strategic access that Russia potentially gains through relationships with Latin American governments hostile to Washington, the demonstration effect showing other regional powers that alternatives to American alignment exist, all of these factors make Venezuela valuable to Russia beyond the immediate economic returns. For China, supporting Venezuela serves both ideological purposes, showing solidarity with a government that shares Beijing's critique of American hegemony, and strategic purposes, complicating American military planning and forcing Washington to divert attention and resources from the Indo-Pacific, where China represents the primary long-term challenge to American power. Iran's involvement, though more limited, follows similar logic, using drones and electronic warfare equipment worth millions to enhance Venezuelan capabilities and demonstrate that Tehran can project influence beyond the Middle East. What this means for the United States is a return to a world that Mearsheimer describes as normal in historical terms, a world where great powers compete continuously for security and influence, where even dominant powers face constraints and challenges, where the anarchic structure of international politics generates what he calls the security dilemma, in which actions taken by one state to increase its security inevitably decrease the security of others and prompt countermeasures that leave everyone less secure than before. The tragedy is that this outcome is largely unavoidable. It flows from the structure of the system rather than from the malign intentions of particular leaders, and even well-meaning states that genuinely seek only security find themselves driven to compete for power because in an anarchic world where no higher authority can guarantee survival, power is the ultimate form of insurance. The United States achieved regional hegemony not because American leaders were uniquely aggressive, but because the structure of international politics incentivized expansion and the elimination of potential rivals in the Western Hemisphere. And now, Russia and China are following similar logic in their own regions, while simultaneously challenging American dominance wherever opportunities arise. The Pentagon's silence, the decision not to escalate dramatically in response to Venezuelan provocation, reflects a mature understanding that the costs of reasserting absolute dominance in the Caribbean might exceed the benefits, especially when American resources are stretched across multiple theaters and when military action against Venezuela could trigger wider regional backlash or escalation with Russia and China in domains where American interests are more vital. This is not weakness. It is strategic calculation based on prioritization of threats, but it does represent a significant change from the era when American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere was so complete that challenges were simply unthinkable. The billions invested in the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, the advanced destroyers, the stealth fighters, all represent the tools of American power, but tools are only as effective as the strategy that employs them. And in a world of renewed great power competition, the United States must make difficult choices about where to apply force and where to exercise restraint. Mearsheimer would argue that these choices are not merely tactical but structural, that the distribution of power in the international system determines what strategies are feasible, and that as China rises and Russia reasserts itself and regional powers like Venezuela find ways to leverage great power competition for their own purposes, the constraints on American action will only increase. To understand what the Venezuelan incident truly represents, we must examine the theoretical framework that Mearsheimer developed in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, a book published in 2001 that has proven remarkably prescient in explaining the dynamics we are witnessing today. Mearsheimer's offensive realism rests on 5 bedrock assumptions about the structure of international politics, assumptions that generate predictions about state behavior, regardless of who leads particular governments or what ideologies they espouse. First, the international system is anarchic, meaning there is no higher authority above states that can enforce rules or guarantee security, no world government that can protect nations from each other. Second, all great powers possess some offensive military capability, the tools to inflict harm on other states. Third, states can never be certain about the intentions of other states because intentions can change and because even defensive capabilities can be used offensively. Fourth, survival is the primary goal of all states, because without survival, nothing else is possible. Fifth, states are rational actors capable of strategic thinking about how to achieve their goals. From these 5 assumptions, which seem relatively uncontroversial when stated plainly, Mearsheimer derives a conclusion that has profound implications for American strategy, that states in an anarchic system will seek to maximize their power because power is the ultimate guarantee of survival, and that the optimal amount of power for any state is regional hegemony, dominance over one's own geographic region. The critical insight that distinguishes Mearsheimer's offensive realism from Kenneth Waltz's defensive realism is that states are not satisfied with the minimum power necessary for security. They seek the maximum power they can feasibly achieve, and for great powers that maximum is regional hegemony. Global hegemony, dominance over the entire world, would provide the ultimate security, but Mearsheimer argues convincingly that global hegemony is impossible because of what he calls the stopping power of water, the fact that large bodies of water make it extraordinarily difficult to project land power across oceans. Naval forces can control seas and conduct expeditionary operations, but they cannot conquer and hold territory the way land armies can. And this geographic reality fundamentally shapes the structure of international politics by preventing any state from achieving worldwide dominance. The United States is the only regional hegemon in the modern world, the only great power that has achieved unquestioned dominance in its own region, and this achievement occurred in the late 1800s after decades of westward expansion eliminated potential rivals. An enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine prevented European powers from establishing a meaningful military presence in the Western Hemisphere. Once America achieved regional hegemony, it adopted a strategy that Mearsheimer calls offshore balancing in other regions, intervening in Europe and Asia not to conquer those regions, but to prevent the rise of another regional hegemon that might eventually challenge American interests. This is the pattern we see throughout the 20th century, with the United States entering World War I to prevent German hegemony in Europe, fighting World War II against both Germany and Japan to prevent hegemonic dominance in Europe and Asia, and then conducting the Cold War to contain Soviet expansion. The logic is straightforward. If another great power achieves regional hegemony in Europe or Asia, it would have the resources and security to potentially challenge American dominance in the Western Hemisphere or American interests globally, so the United States has a powerful incentive to prevent any such outcome, even at enormous cost. The problem we face in 2025 is that this strategy assumes continued American hegemony in our own hemisphere. It assumes that we do not have to worry about military threats close to home and can therefore project power across oceans to shape the balance of power in distant regions. What the Venezuelan confrontation reveals is that this assumption is being tested in ways not seen since the 19th century, that Russia and China are deliberately supporting Venezuela with billions of dollars in weapons and economic assistance precisely to challenge American dominance in the Caribbean and force Washington to divert resources and attention from Europe and Asia, where the primary strategic competitions are unfolding. The numbers tell a sobering story about American strategic overstretch and the limits even a superpower faces when commitments exceed resources. The United States defense budget for 2024 stood at approximately $850 billion, by far the largest in the world, representing roughly 40% of global military spending, despite America accounting for only about 15% of global GDP. Yet this massive investment, this concentration of resources on military capability that dwarfs any potential rival, has not prevented the emergence of serious challenges across multiple theaters simultaneously. In Europe, the United States has committed tens of billions of dollars to supporting Ukraine against Russian invasion, with total American assistance exceeding $70 billion by late 2024 and no clear end in sight. In the Middle East, renewed conflict between Israel and Hamas, followed by broader regional tensions involving Iran and its proxies, has drawn American military assets and diplomatic attention, with the United States deploying carrier strike groups worth billions and providing billions more in military aid to Israel. In the Indo-Pacific, China's military modernization represents the most significant long-term challenge to American power, with Beijing's official defense budget exceeding $225 billion in recent years, and actual spending likely much higher when accounting for programs hidden in other budget categories. China has invested hundreds of billions over the past 2 decades building a blue water navy capable of challenging American dominance in the Western Pacific, commissioning aircraft carriers like the Liaoning, Shandong, and Fujian, developing advanced anti-ship ballistic missiles like the DF-21D, designed specifically to target American carriers, and creating hypersonic weapon systems that current American defenses cannot reliably intercept. The People's Liberation Army Navy now operates more ships than the United States Navy, and while American vessels remain more capable individually, the sheer numbers and geographic proximity give China significant advantages in any conflict near its coasts. President Xi Jinping has explicitly stated his intention to transform the PLA into a world-class military by 2049, capable of fighting and winning wars, and the resources Beijing is devoting to this goal, combined with China's massive economy and technological base, mean this is not an idle threat. The problem for American strategists is that defending Taiwan, maintaining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and preserving alliance commitments to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia all require substantial military presence and readiness in the Indo-Pacific, presence that competes with commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and now potentially in our own hemisphere. If you are finding this analysis valuable, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you do not miss future lectures on geopolitical developments that affect all of our lives. Comment below and let me know where you are watching from, what city and what country, because understanding how these global dynamics play out requires perspectives from across the world, not just from Washington or American institutions. The Atlantic Council estimated in early 2024 that the United States needs an additional $300 billion in annual defense spending just to revitalize the defense industrial base to meet current commitments, let alone prepare for potential conflict with China. American ammunition production, missile manufacturing, and shipbuilding capacity have atrophied after decades of reduced investment following the Cold War, and the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East have exposed critical shortages. When the United States provides Ukraine with HIMARS rockets or Patriot missiles worth millions per unit, those come from existing stockpiles that take years to replenish at current production rates, and every missile sent to Europe is one not available for defense of Taiwan or deterrence of China. The same dynamic applies to Israel, where American support in the form of munitions, intelligence assets, and defensive systems draws on limited resources that have competing demands. This is what Mearsheimer means when he talks about the tragedy of great power politics, that even a state as powerful as the United States faces hard choices imposed by the structure of the international system, choices about where to allocate finite resources among infinite potential threats. Venezuela's challenge to American naval operations in the Caribbean must be understood in this broader context of strategic overstretch and multipolar competition. Moscow and Beijing recognize that the United States cannot be everywhere at once with sufficient force to guarantee outcomes, and supporting Venezuela with relatively modest investments, the $14 billion Russia spent on arms sales over 2 decades, the billions China has provided in loans and economic assistance, the millions Iran contributes through military technology transfers, all represent asymmetric strategies to impose costs on American power. From a Russian perspective, spending a few $billions to maintain Venezuela as a strategic partner in the Western Hemisphere is extraordinarily cost-effective if it forces Washington to maintain additional naval presence in the Caribbean, divert intelligence assets to monitor Venezuelan military capabilities, and engage in diplomatic efforts to prevent other Latin American nations from following Caracas down the path of alignment with Moscow and Beijing. Every American destroyer stationed near Venezuela to deter aggression or respond to provocations is a destroyer not available for operations in the Baltic Sea, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, or the South China Sea. Every F-35 fighter deployed to Puerto Rico as part of the military buildup in response to Venezuelan defiance is a fighter not available for deterrence missions near Taiwan or support for NATO operations in Europe. The financial dimension extends beyond direct military spending to encompass the broader economic costs of maintaining global hegemony in an era of renewed great power competition. The United States national debt exceeds $33 trillion, with annual deficits running over $1 trillion even in peacetime. And defense spending represents a growing share of a budget already strained by entitlement commitments and interest payments on existing debt. President Trump and subsequent administrations have increased defense spending substantially, but this comes at the expense of other priorities or requires additional borrowing that worsens long-term fiscal sustainability. NATO allies in Europe spend approximately $240 billion collectively on defense, which sounds substantial until you realize that America's European allies defend a combined economy larger than the United States, yet rely on Washington for nuclear deterrence, power projection, and the bulk of advanced military capabilities. Trump's criticism of European free-riding has substance. Many NATO members spent less than 2% of GDP on defense for decades, relying on American security guarantees while directing resources to social programs and economic development. The problem is that even as European spending has increased in response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, with most NATO members now meeting or exceeding the 2% target, the fundamental dynamic remains that American military commitments worldwide exceed what even an $850 billion defense budget can sustainably support. Mearsheimer's theory helps explain why this situation emerged and why it is likely to persist despite American efforts to shift burdens to allies. In an anarchic international system, states ultimately rely on their own power for survival, and allies are useful but unreliable because their interests may diverge when crises occur. European nations have increased defense spending not primarily because Trump demanded it, but because Russian actions in Ukraine demonstrated that American security guarantees might not be sufficient if Washington faces simultaneous crises in multiple regions. Similarly, Asian allies like Japan and South Korea are investing hundreds of billions in military modernization because they recognize that if war breaks out with China, they cannot assume American forces will arrive in time or in sufficient strength to guarantee their security. This is the security dilemma that Mearsheimer describes, where actions taken by states to increase their own security inevitably threaten the security of others and prompt countermeasures that leave everyone less secure. China's military buildup, driven by legitimate concerns about American containment and the vulnerability of trade routes through waters dominated by the U.S. Navy forces America and its allies to spend more on defense, which in turn validates Chinese fears of encirclement and justifies further military investment. Venezuela fits into this pattern as a smaller power leveraging great power competition to pursue its own survival and regional ambitions. Maduro's government faces existential threats from American sanctions that have cost the Venezuelan economy hundreds of billions in lost revenue, from diplomatic isolation orchestrated by Washington, from repeated regime change efforts that include CIA operations and support for opposition movements, and from the constant possibility of direct military intervention. From Caracas's perspective, aligning with Russia, China, and Iran is not ideological preference but strategic necessity. These partnerships provide the military capabilities, economic lifelines, and diplomatic support that make regime survival possible in the face of American hostility. The billions spent on Russian weapon systems, while economically burdensome for a country struggling with hyperinflation and shortages, represent insurance against the far greater cost of regime collapse. The Buk-MTOE air defense systems, the Su-30 fighters, the anti-ship missiles all create enough deterrent capability that American military planners must account for potential casualties and operational complications that make intervention less attractive. This brings us to the heart of what Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics, the recognition that structural forces drive states toward competition and conflict even when leaders are rational and seek only security. The United States did not seek confrontation with Venezuela. American policymakers would prefer that Caracas simply accept Washington's leadership in hemispheric affairs, as most Latin American nations did throughout the 20th century. But the structure of the international system, characterized by anarchy and uncertainty about intentions, means Venezuela cannot simply trust American benevolence and must take measures to ensure its own survival. Those measures, acquiring billions in weapons from Russia and forging partnerships with China and Iran, threaten American interests by potentially providing hostile powers with access to the Western Hemisphere and by demonstrating to other nations that alternatives to American alignment exist. This in turn prompts American responses, sanctions, military buildups, covert operations, which validate Venezuelan fears and justify further defensive measures in a spiral that has no clear endpoint. The Monroe Doctrine, which for 200 years served as the organizing principle of American policy in the Western Hemisphere, rested on the assumption that the United States possessed sufficient power to prevent external great powers from establishing meaningful presence in the Americas. That assumption held through the Cold War despite Soviet support for Cuba, because Moscow lacked the economic resources and geographic access to seriously challenge American dominance. What has changed in 2025 is that China now possesses an economy comparable to America's and resources to invest hundreds of billions globally, while Russia under Putin has rebuilt sufficient military capability and has a willingness to challenge American interests wherever opportunities arise. Venezuela represents one such opportunity, a nation geographically close to the United States, possessing the world's largest proven oil reserves potentially worth trillions of dollars, governed by a regime hostile to Washington and desperate for external support. For relatively modest investments measured in billions rather than hundreds of billions, Russia and China can sustain Venezuelan defiance and force the United States to commit resources to a problem that distracts from higher priorities in Europe and Asia. The September 2025 incident with the USS Jason Dunham symbolizes this new reality, where American naval vessels operating in waters that have been uncontested for generations now face harassment from a regional power backed by great power rivals. The Pentagon's decision not to escalate dramatically, to maintain strategic silence rather than respond with overwhelming force, reflects mature understanding that the costs of reasserting absolute dominance might exceed the benefits. Military action against Venezuelan air defense systems or military bases would likely succeed in tactical terms. American stealth aircraft and cruise missiles worth hundreds of millions could destroy billions in Venezuelan military assets within days. But the political costs would be substantial, reinforcing anti-American sentiment across Latin America, potentially triggering a wider regional crisis, providing Russia and China with propaganda victories, and most importantly, diverting resources and attention from theaters where American interests are more directly threatened. This is the paradox that Mearsheimer identifies, that overwhelming military superiority does not automatically translate into political outcomes when the costs of using force exceed the value of the objectives at stake. The tragedy is that there is no way back to the world that existed before, no return to unquestioned American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere without costs that Washington is unwilling or unable to pay. Every day that Venezuelan forces operate Russian equipment and conduct operations that would have been unthinkable a generation ago, the precedent strengthens that American dominance is no longer absolute. Other Latin American nations observe this dynamic and draw conclusions about the viability of closer relationships with Moscow and Beijing, about the possibilities of pursuing independent foreign policies that diverge from Washington's preferences. The billions that the United States invests in military presence, in economic assistance to preferred governments, in diplomatic efforts to maintain influence, all compete with investments needed for challenges in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The structure of international politics that Mearsheimer describes, where great powers compete for security in an anarchic system, has reasserted itself after the brief unipolar moment following the Cold War, and the United States, like all great powers throughout history, must now make difficult choices about priorities, about where to commit finite resources among infinite potential threats, about which challenges to confront and which to tolerate. This is the deeper meaning of the Venezuelan confrontation, not that Caracas poses an existential threat to American security, but that even a relatively minor challenge in our own hemisphere now requires resources and attention that we can ill afford given commitments elsewhere, and that the structural forces driving great power competition make these dilemmas unavoidable regardless of who occupies the White House or what strategies we adopt. Mearsheimer's offensive realism provides no solutions, no policy prescriptions that can escape the tragedy he describes, but it offers clear-eyed understanding of why cooperation is hard, why security competition persists, and why even the most powerful state in history cannot guarantee its own security without constant vigilance and competition. The Venezuelan forces that locked onto the USS Jason Dunham in September 2025 were not signaling the end of American power, but they were demonstrating the limits of that power in a multipolar world where even regional hegemons face constraints, where geography and economics and the anarchic structure of international politics impose costs that cannot be avoided through military superiority alone. There is no way back now to the certainty of the Monroe Doctrine, to the assumption that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America by right, and the only path forward is through the tragic dynamics of great power competition that Mearsheimer has spent his career explaining.